I always start off my lessons telling my students, you know really how easy it is to hit a tennis ball. And we all know that it's not that easy to hit a tennis ball. But really, when you start to really feel the game of tennis, it's such an effortless swing. When you watch pros on TV, and especially with golf, I mean, or women golfers, they hit the ball so far, so hard with no effort. Tennis players, same thing. You watch a great professional tennis player, Rafa, Roger, and it's this effortlessness. Yet across the net, when I teach lessons, I see these players just kind of fighting and trying to get the ball squeezed too hard. And so I really changed the focus of my teaching philosophy to try to teach people that hitting a tennis ball is really about three things: creating, storing, and releasing energy. So to me, CSR sounds like that TV show CSI is kind of a sexy title. So I get my students to listen and say, Christophe, well, how do I create, store, and release energy? Well, let's talk about the three different ways you can create energy. One is momentum. Momentum, if I swing my racket back and forth this way, I get a lot of energy from the racket. Two, momentum from my footwork. So the ground is a great source of energy. I can just kind of push off the ground. So that's free energy right there. And three is how you utilize your body. Coiling and uncoiling versus turning. It's a term that I use a lot. So you have these three ways how to create energy. How do you store the energy? Well, that's where it gets a little tricky. It's the timing of it. Is when you're going to take your racket back, when you're going to start your swing, how long you're going to hold the preparation. That's how you store the energy. And I'll show you in a little bit the three different ways that you can store that energy when you're hitting a forehand or backhand or a serve. And now how do you release that energy? And to me, out of the CSR, the control, store, create, store, and release, is the way you release the energy is how I want you to think of hitting a tennis ball. I don't want you to think about hitting a ball. Is when you're hitting the ball, you're just releasing to the shot. So a different way of looking at it, but to me, creating, storing, and releasing energy is really how you should think an approach of hitting a tennis ball. So let's talk about the forehand first. How do I create energy on my forehand side? Well, you non-hitting hand, I just happen to be right-handed. So my non-hitting hand is my left hand. And the first thing you want to do is when you prepare your stroke is not to let the racket go back. That's an energy killer. And we too often in the old days, get your racket back. But if you were to turn your shoulders and keep both hands on the racket, you're going to see that you're going to stop your racket from going back. And that's good because you're going to kind of hold, you're going to create energy by keeping the racket right here versus behind you. And I'll show you how it's going to come into releasing the energy. Number two, you're not going to turn your entire body, but you're going to coil. So this is getting my students to turn sideways. So I say turn sideways, they'll go like this right away. What I want you to turn is I want you to turn this way. So you rotate your shoulders beyond your hips. And watch, if I'm just standing like this, let's say, Christophe, relax. My body comes around naturally. So I have all this energy kind of pent in here. So I'm creating energy by keeping my left hand on my racket that has helped me to coil. Number two, that gets a little more, if you're like a 4-5 or 5-0 player, or if you want to hit the ball like a 4-5, 5-0 player, what you can do is when you're in your preparation phase, during the creating part of storing and creating energy, is you keep the head of the racket in front of your hand. And that what it will do is will have you that energy kind of stay in front of your hand, so when you go to hit the ball, you can release that energy instead of having the racket behind your hand. So how do you now release the energy? And this is where you really have to think of the game differently. And hitting a tennis ball, you say, all this energy that I created right here, that I'm storing, that I'm holding, I just want to go out there and just release it. And how do you release energy? And I'm going to show you that all the strokes, I'm talking about the forehand now, I want to talk about the backhand or the serve, you lead with the butt cap of the racket. So as I'm ready to engage the backswing phase, is I'm ready to throw my racket to the ball, I'm starting with the butt cap first and not the racket. Too often, this is a stroke killer. Everybody wants to use their racket. It's the only thing they think about. So here comes the ball, they throw the racket at the ball. What you want to do is the last thing that gets engaged is your racket. I coiled, I use the ground as a source of energy, I push off, and right before I go hit the ball, I lead with the butt cap, and as I lead with the butt cap, the head of the racket will come all by itself, and the shot will release through. I never really talk about the follow-through when I teach tennis because the follow-through to me is a product of all the great things that you did ahead of time. So on the forehand, you create it by keeping your non-hitting hand on the racket, coiling versus turning, holding the racket in front of your hand. That's how you store the energy. And you release it by really just pushing off your footwork. But the most important part is to lead with the butt cap of the racket versus leading with the head of the racket. And a lot of times I describe the using the racket, it's like the dog that wags the tail, not the tail that wags the dog. So you want to have your body manipulates the racket. Let's go on to the one-handed backhand. How do I create energy? Again, same thing. I'm going to keep the head of my racket in front of my body. I'm not going to let the racket get away from me. I'm going to leak the energy. I want to keep it across on my body. I want to keep my non-hitting hand on the racket once again. So my first move is not to take the racket back, but it's to coil. So I'm going to create and store the energy just by turning my shoulders beyond my hips and holding that position and move it about the court this way. So I'm creating it, storing it, keeping it close to my body. Now, when I'm about to hit it, again, I'm going to use the ground as a source of power to push off. And once again, here comes the butt cap of the racket. As I'm about to engage the backswing phase of the racket, backswing phase of the stroke, as I'm swinging my racket, again, I'm swinging the butt cap first. So when it comes to making contact with the ball, it's a release. And again, I'm not going to talk about the follow-through because it's a product of all the good things that I did ahead of time. So again, I'm approaching the ball, trying to feel like I'm getting stronger as the ball is coming to me. I'm creating all this energy, keeping it close, and then releasing it when I'm hitting it. Let's talk about the two-handed backhand. Same thing again as the other strokes. Obviously, my non-hitting is on the racket. So what I want to do is I want to turn my shoulders again, not take my racket back, keep my racket close to my body, keep the head of the racket above the hands. And that's what you have to do if you have a two-handed backhand. When the backswing of the racket finishes, do not have the head of the racket below your hand. You want to keep the head of the racket above your hand. Once again, same thing. I'm holding this, I'm timing it, I'm holding this energy in. I'm not letting my racket go back behind me until I'm ready to push off the ground. And once again, leading with the butt cap and releasing through. When we go to the serve, believe it or not, the butt cap is going to be very, very important. I could break down the serve so many different ways. You can serve so many different styles, but give you two great tips on how to create, store, and release energy. Number one, you have to be relaxed, and you see all the pros, they always kind of rock back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So have a nice little rocking motion. You wait on the front foot, you wait to the back foot. And like all the other strokes, I want to coil. I want to coil back away from my opponent. So you're rocking, you're coiling, and you go into your continuous motion. Don't try to just think about the trophy position, the power position. It's a nice fluid motion. But again, the most important part, if you want to be able to release that energy, again, it's all about releasing when you hit the ball. Okay, not fighting it, is to lead with the butt cap of the racket. And the last second, the racket comes through, and you can, once again, the follow through. I don't really discuss it. So that was a quick talk about a different way of looking at hitting a tennis ball. And instead of thinking about just the racket itself, is think about how do I manipulate my body? How does my body work into hitting the tennis ball? So coiling, uncoiling, holding that energy, and then releasing it. And if you remember one thing out of this lecture, is lead with the butt cap before making contact on every single shot.